So last week we more or less covered magnetism through um, see if I can get backwards here. Yeah, through the magnetic field, and now we're going to focus a little bit on the electric field portion and use a magnet as an example. But the magnet more or less represents resonance of likeness, and so that's why you see magnets attract their own kind, if you will, in the Ferris group. But I guess the important thing to understand is that all matter possesses some sort of north and south pole, and they're not symmetrical. So the magnet is just a good teacher of the toroidal field, and in modern times we have a picture of that. We can produce that. So a little bit of review. In the end, as far as subtle energy goes, which we're just using a magnet to kind of cross the bridge, because we can measure force and sense force directly through a magnet. But it's more or less the principle of the magnet that we're looking at, and we really don't care about magnetic and electric forces and the complications associated with it. We're getting into the subtle energies that are present in all things and can be concentrated and used for benefit. And magnets are one of the things that you can do that with. Also crystals, but really it's everything. It's just magnets and crystals, and certain materials tend to have an amplified version of it. So the reasons why some of these things work for us at certain times and not others is due to these qualities, and it's more or less your intuition and the methods of using and cultivating your intuition, which aren't mostly just gifts you're given per se. If anything, you kind of lose your sensitivity as you get older, and you forget all the things you could sense when you were younger, and so you have to train yourself, like lifting weights or exercising, to get these things working again and get the mind a little bit out of the way. Not completely, but the mind with its belief systems and its programming often get in the way of using all these beautiful gifts. Water kind of being the embodiment of a lot of these qualities, and the ability to hold and buffer and tune these things so they work better for us. And so that's what we spend a lot of time studying, is water's unique ability to take energies and transform them into something that the body needs. So with water, it's a lot less important if you get the South Pole and the North Pole right, or if you get the integrative or the pressural side of those poles, meaning, okay, there's no such thing as a plus and a minus and a north and a south anymore after this. And that's really the point, is to break down that false duality and bring quality to the North Pole and the South Pole and both of the poles within that, and realize that there's layers or dimensions of understanding where things get more complicated unless you know how to tie it all back where it came from. And when we talk about subtle energies, we're more or less talking about the fundamental simple truth of all one phase changing substance, just like water, that is the universe is filled with. And it's separated from matter to some degree, but there is openings, and if we in the human body, which is comprised of atoms. So we're going to take this subtle energy and this magnetism and electricism and like reduce it back to what your body's comprised of, which gets complicated again, the atomic table in hardcore form, and how the soul lives inside of that more or less machine, biological machine, that's fully intelligent and fully adaptable, way beyond anything we've ever really developed technologically. This is going to be a little hit again. There's certain things in this 4-part series that we're just going to keep repeating for people who haven't seen it, and also for the people who have, in case you want to go deeper into it. These are people, and here I highlighted Wilhelm Reich and Bechamp because the two are highly connected into pleomorphism. And Bechamp's big statement was life preys on life, that there's really no such thing as a Darwinian force of dominance. When one thing becomes dominant, something you don't see eventually swings around and becomes even more predominant. For instance, like your body is governed by its microbiome, and it's way beyond what current medicine and science can see. And that's what Bechamp went into in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And Louis Pasteur was kind of like the hired bank, collegiate, institutionalized hitman that, tried to twist Bechamp's work away from the beautiful discovery that any raw mineral, like especially the lighter metals like calcium, that you would mine that were, millions of years old, had living potential or critters in it. And so basically the world started trying to sterilize everything because it was teaching that you catch things or consume things. Your terrain and your blood and your water don't play any role in what you grow. And that's neither is completely false or completely true, but I would say it's kind of like the North Pole, South Pole thing, that the North Pole integrative field is generally going to cause life to come forward at a higher rate, and it's better to focus on growing good things than killing bad things is going to be the future of medicine. It already is with the leading edge. You'll hear all the leading doctors that are considered fringe talk about the gut and controlling your microbiome, because it when that falls apart, it gets into your blood, and once it gets into your blood, it gets into your liver. Your liver no longer is adaptive. It goes into defense mode, and then the autoimmune triggers, and then it comes out as anything and everything wherever your body's weak. And that's all disease. So that's the beauty of this, is all disease is really the same thing. You can get some special cases with bioweaponry, in my opinion, where it's designed to trick the human body to turn things off. And today's kind of feature is Wilhelm Reich. And so we'll close out with that whole story on how that relates to overall bloodborne conditions, and how that relates to the basis of life, and even the Mayan calendar we have at the bottom here, and the Egyptians, and how they viewed the buildup of life over 16.4 billion years in this current cycle. So that, the cycle we're in, where the rules are somewhat the same for 16.4 billion years. And they were able to figure that out accurately just through common principle and scale. So hopefully that's what we accomplish in the end of this, is we have a real simple understanding that your blood terrain, in other words, the water in your body, has a memory and a momentum. So you can't just take a severe South Pole condition in the blood and put a North Pole magnet on it and fix it. And it might be a little bit of temporary relief, but there's a momentum that's going to swing back. It has a memory. So this is something that changes slowly and gradually for very good reason, and that's stability. And that's why everything is here and exists, and why atoms exist, why matter exists. So just, even if all you ever do is look at your relationship with atomic matter, for me, that's what I studied at the beginning of my industrial engineering career, and since a child, I was always wanted to know what the constituent of the universe was that was firm and believable and confirmable. And it turns out those all change while keeping their ID. Like a human being can change its behavior, the atoms change their behavior, but I'm still John and you're still Bob, and that's how it goes. So any of these people, if you tie all these together, you kind of get this huge unified foundation. And we're going to close part 4 with Victor Schauberger primarily. I won't get into and so the objectives here are to make tools. So like, let's just take calcium, like, or silicon or oxygen or hydrogen, the constituents of water, which when they come together are no longer hydrogen and oxygen. They're a new thing. They're actually the centering point for hydrogen and oxygen. That's why they collect around it. So water is more of a principle and an energy that collect certain beings of the atomic world. I call them intraterrestrial beings and extraterrestrial beings. Perhaps we need to be more concerned about the living nature of what we're made up of rather than worrying about extraterrestrials. So you use these as tools, and we went into that a little bit with electronegative and electropositive last time. And so this becomes a universal model, and Walter Russell's a big guy on that for a good universal, like, musical model. We'll look at some of his work later with the atomic charts. And then all is comprised of lines, which is what you call the matrix. And the matrix, you know, in the movies has a negative connotation, but there actually is a matrix of nature, and it's the phi rectangle, and that gives us the asymmetry that tells the torsion fields where to turn in quarter waves, which I always remind about Tesla saying the quarter wave is all that really matters, because it's changing. Every time a pressure cycle comes up, it changes poles at the peak, and changes size in the next radius. And so these are ideals: the circle, the changing radius circle, and the rectangular asymmetrical right angles are kind of what gives us our matrix pattern, and then how everything manifests, from trees to lightning to phase changes in water to all the animals. Your human body is entirely comprised of this slight alterations of the phi ratio and all its derivatives, and that kind of gets a little complicated once you get beyond the golden mean and the phoenix sequence, which show how nature can resolve any relationship within 9 steps, which is why I believe you have 9 numbers. And then it starts repeating. 10 is 1, 11 is 2, 12 is 3. So the principles are 0 through 9. 12 is the first manifest. So you see there's 12 notes in music before the octave repeats, or 12 months in the solar year before it repeats, 9 in the moon cycle like the Mayans used. So you see these 2 number systems, a base 9 and a base 12. The base 10 is kind of more of an artifact of trying to make unity or isolate something, but you really can never isolate anything. There's no evidence for it. All right. So water's the simplest form to work with, seems to be the best for cohering life. So elements are categorized by that which prefer to breathe in and breathe out. We talked about this with the electronegative and electropositive classification. So when you see this whole elemental table, there's a lot of stuff on it. It's kind of hard to make sense out of, and chemistry tries to teach it, and there's some value in the way they're grouped and what's going on, but really confusing for the layman or somebody who takes 1 or 2 years of chemistry without any practical application. And worse yet for people who, are programmed in an overcomplicated way. But nonetheless, chemists do a good job of making things that are useful. Sometimes they're pretty poisonous and out of tune with nature. So there's the difficult side of that. So we determine that magnetism by all the laws and mathematics that are established in electrical engineering, which is very primordial to matter and chemistry. So therefore at the root of the manifest. So magnetism is the outward pressure that exists both in the North and the South Pole. And it's a concentric principle, but we can find no center by measurement anywhere in the universe. Every time we try and find a center, it moves, or we see a void where there's space, and space is nothing as far as matter concerns. There's no principle, there's nothing to measure, there's nothing other than space. It's just lack of, so to speak. But on the contrary, this seems to be a porthole for subtle energies that predominate or exist before electromagnetic principles. And today we're just going to point at the opposite of the magnetism, which is circles going outwards. We can show pictures of that. And then look at the electric side. So everybody has a real world. That's like the quantum or subquantum transition. So you can't really measure any electrons circulating around a magnet or a crystal. But if you take that crystal and park it in a certain situation, like with a metal, copper has resistance to a magnetic field. So you'll see the manifest of some type of light and charge and some type of darkness form when we move a magnet next to a copper wire. And that's how all our power is generated. So other than the motion, the energy already exists right there. And there's probably a lot more efficient ways to create motion than create heat and resistance with the rotating magnet. So a lot of the stuff that teaches us how to heal each other, how to heal ourselves, how to heal plants, how to heal animals, how to heal the planet, right? A lot of this is all connected with some simple principles, and there's been many, many years of study for it. So that's what we're really trying to get, is what is the simple thing going on here. And most people find that religion, right? But then that gets kind of dualistically complicated in itself. So you get a lot of philosophy occurring, kind of like the Tao or the Taoists, like contrary statements, because that's what you see. Once you figure something out, then the next step is an unknown that's a deeper layer of the same thing, and often they conflict each other. So no thing is concentric, meaning there's no center. There's no one place that centers everything, which means there's no space-time is not a dominant factor. Principle is, and it has nothing to do with matter. And both alternate in principle and simultaneously existence. And line wobble DNA, nothing goes in a straight line. There's no such thing as a phi rectangle, and it's manifest for the most part. There's just points of change that make a code. And atoms have that. So even though DNA stands for nucleic acid, what we're saying is there's information within that, and the subscript is in atoms, which, comprise DNA. And inside the atom is nothing, which has all this code. And all through history, some people call it the Akashic Record or this or that. There's all these names for it. You can only void one condition, and space is the void of all conditions. But that is the condition that everything centers around. So if we look at the center of the galaxy, we can't find a center in it. There's no reference point. We can't get an accurate measurement, but there's a voided condition. Call it the reset, where everything gets recirculated and rebuilt with greater quality. Because if it didn't, then matter wouldn't manifest and life wouldn't exist. So we know that's a fact by the reality that life does exist. We have consciousness of it and we perceive it. So now on to the atoms, the minerals, and the seeds and the spore of these. So these principles of having a spore or a seed hatch into and grow something and then remake more seeds and give nutrients as it's doing it is a repetitious cycle that exists within your body, and it also exists within every other situation. So a little more touch on the review. There's a black line going down the center here, and last time we talked about the qualities of Reichenbach and how he used human beings to identify these situations and what these elements do. And so if we wanted to accelerate and raise quality, which one of these minerals we pick would determine, the level of quality we would want for whatever circumstance. And so you see there's a lot of stuff that's in the electropositive category and much fewer elements that are in the electronegative. And the electronegative things, or the negative odd, which is the magnetic north pole or the point of a crystal, or the blue light, tends to be an accelerating function and has certain qualities. It doesn't mean quality alone. It just means regeneration would recur faster or life would form faster. So it could be misapplied or overused. And that's what I like to get into, is there is not a good or a bad on either side of this line. Either has quality that's used, and more frequently, the lesser number is used in the growth categories. So you see way up top carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, which is basically minus hydrogen, which is also electronegative, but I don't see them listed here. It's slightly electronegative. It's moving for me. Is it static for everybody else? Somebody's saying the slideshow isn't moving. So right now I'm on a Paracelsus quote page and an electronegativity page. Is your mic still on, Todd?
Yeah, that was just earlier.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you can keep going. Everything is fine now.
Okay, appreciate it. So you kind of get an idea of where water gets its strength, and carbon and hydrogen have a very close relationship. So whenever you see carbon, you can also think like a more evolved version, an older version of hydrogen. Hydrogen being the baby, or I won't say seed, but essentially it's the seed for the whole atomic table, a proton. And the positive charge, that's where things start growing. And we see a lot of charge flip-flopping. So bio south is the same thing as magnetic north. So all throughout history, you see this confusion of how to assign the charge. So you'll see chemists fighting with physicists, fighting with all these people fighting over what is right or wrong between Democratic and Republican, and neither of them are correct. It's how they both work together. And those are always more at the extreme ends when you isolate them. And you see chlorine up here too, and everybody's programmed that chlorine's bad, but chlorine's all over in nature. All the atomic characters are all over in nature. It's the form they change into by the terrain they were put in. So carbon that comes from a heat process is not anywhere near as good as carbon that comes from a cold process. So if you have a filter that's made from, burnt waste byproduct, it's going to be transferring that low quality carbon over. Whereas if you have a diamond, you transfer a different property into the water, right? If water's flowing over this. I'm always probably going to relate back to water because that's what we primarily do. And you see nitrogen is dominant over oxygen in the air in quantity and volume, but it doesn't interact as much. It kind of blocks interaction. So whenever you see like nitrogen involved, it delays a reaction, and then you get more energy out of it. That's why nitrogen's seen a lot in like bombs or nitromethane fuel in race cars, the most powerful race cars. So you see nitrogen kind of act like a barrier between a reaction a little bit and slows it down. But when it occurs, it's more powerful because of the buildup. So there's all these finite qualities to the overall situation, but generally, regeneration and rebuilding and growth is going to be caused by the North Pole, and then there's quality to that. So a lot of these elements, like palladium, so the platinum group metals, palladium and silver are in the light. And why does palladium react so strongly with water? When I started looking into this, right, it's all the other platinum groups like gold, even silver, the light platinum groups, platinum, rhodium, all these things in that area that have strong reactions with this life force field. They're mostly the electropositive, which suppress or break growth. So is silicon, which you see is a very dominant substance. So is
Jonathan.
yeah.
We're stuck on page 27.
None of us can see the screens moving. It's all stuck on slide 27.
Oh, I'm not even on there. Never even went to that.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Is somebody else moving it around?
Nobody
No, it's just on screen share.
Move at all.
You're still on screen share, but it's showing us like the Wilhelm Reich page 27 on the slide.
Oh, I never even went to that slide. Yeah, this platform sucks. It's disappointing. All right, I'm just going to start it over. That's the second time it screwed up. getting to know the elements a little bit and which ones make the blue light, which are the accelerator in the car, and which ones make the brakes. And like I said, you need both as you accelerate your own integrative field, which is core to consciousness and chakra alignment. According to all this subtle energy study, no matter which version we're looking at, you need both. And the faster you get, the more brakes you need too. So every day you go through an acceleration and an energy expression when you're awake, and then at night you invert and rest, and both of them have good qualities. So getting to know the elements and getting to know magnets, which is kind of the oversimplified behavior of every atom, is behaving in a toroidal field, and it has its own north and south pole. And in the north, it has an accelerating function and a braking function, and in the south, it has an accelerating and a braking or decelerating braking function. So like the south would be more like how you let off the brakes and how you let off the accelerator, and the north would tend to be the opposite, how you apply the accelerator, and it's going to tend to want to accelerate those functions overall. So when you use them both together, you get kind of this complicated hodgepodge that is all things, is the chemistry of all things. And this is Walter Russell's chart of showing you the qualities and how they change. So we start with what scientists were not able to predict, and Walter Russell took math and music like the Mayans did and predicted things smaller than we had discovered at the time, and he predicted things at the extreme larger end. Unfortunately, when he achieved verifiable transmutation and the methods of how to do that, he went to the Department of Energy, and same thing happened to him as everybody else. So you start to wonder why these luminaries all ran to the wrong side of the equation and kind of tipped them off, and then they went and developed it in darkness and started using it and hid it from everybody. When in reality, like a third grader could understand most of this, because it's, you take a little hydrogen proton and you keep combining them together, and the heavier they get when you get to the far end down here, where uranium lives, things start to become somewhat unstable because they're carrying too many neutrons for the amount of protons, meaning they're carrying too much deceleration for life and not enough acceleration for life, and so they fall apart. But I always remind people uranium's actually highly stable because it has a half-life of, all those radioactive elements have half-lives of billions of years, so they're very stable in nature, but they do domino really hard when they're close together. So mankind goes around and picks up needles out of a haystack and puts them together so we can do constructive and destructive things with it. In the long run, is probably not a good idea because of these subtle energies that are associated. So if we collect a lot of uranium, there's a subtle effect in the area that's happening, and in the long run it could still turn out to be a good thing because nature always evolves. So one thing I want to mention about this, about seeds, so if we had to have seeds for atoms, they would be the inert gases. And if you noticed on the electronegative or electropositive table we were previously looking at, they didn't list any of the inert gases. However, they are key to generating things. So basically each octave of these elements, and so here if we see carbon on this line in the third octave, in the fourth octave we see silicon, and in the fifth octave we see iron and cobalt kind of sitting over the top, and nickel, and that's where you're going to get magnetism. So the earth in a sense is kind of in the fifth octave and has been for a while, and the underlying drivers of that water would be comprised of the second, third, and fourth octaves kind of coming together. The beach and silicon and the water being predominantly water, and then the core of the earth, or the foundation, and what comes from the inside, the iron and the heat, that deliver the minerals that clean the ocean, like the symbiotics, those types of things. And then after that, we get into the platinum group, and we start to see a little bit of magic starts to come in the door if you get into the work of Hudson and Ormus. And all these things are designed in our units, both in the old and in the new stuff. So I'm sharing a lot of the design principles of how all this works and how you can make a lot of it work for you if you want to manufacture your own things. Like a lot of what we put into the carbon gene and make in pyramids, there's, doctors who have 500 patents, who have 5 degrees, and they sell little baggies of material that you hang in your trees, and the fruit goes better, grows better. You can make your own, and there's no magic secret to it. I just gave it to you. You can start to make your own recipes of these electronegative elements. And you can throw a little bit of electropositive in there too to balance it out. Babbitt's particle shows the detail. So the inside of this, you see that tighter vortex in the middle of this toroid, and the why I bring this up all the time, Babbitt's particle, is because you can see like the pointy side of the egg shape here that represents every electron, every cell, every atom is the same. And this guy, Babbitt, and I think it was like 1780s, about the same time Béchamp was far superseding our current understanding of biology today as a whole. We had all the answers roughly back then. And it was with people's intuition and experimentation and their dreams that they came up with this stuff. And it turns out it's, way more accurate and way more simple than what we have going on today. You see there's things are even number sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6, right? And so they're starting to assign like basic numerology to these equations and colors. If you really read in here, there's blue and green and red being the brakes, blue being the accelerator. And down the middle is your integrated field. So this is the center of a magnet. So if I put a gyroscope in here, and you can go to YouTube and watch various people demonstrate this. I'm not going to do it. Other people already have. And you take a big enough magnet to encompass the gyroscope runs way longer than it should. So now you have like, a sort of a free energy understanding, or a more efficient energy system base. And then that same north or south pole will keep that gyroscope running. And if you move that gyroscope to the exterior of the magnet, it will break, which is kind of like the force field of all things. Like Gerald Pollack's easy water has nothing to do with structured water other than that is a fortified force field around the body of water. And that's your diaphragm that's going to read the outside and communicate from the inside to the outer world, like a speaker, like a three-dimensional speaker. Everything is going to go through that dense situation. If you over-densify that, it gets over-brittle like an eggshell, and it fractures easier. It's not as fluid, but it does have a memory. So that would be considered like over-hardened water when it gets too much of a force field. It's too much stress coming from the outside, so the water keeps building up. And intuitives can sense this. I used to over harden the water. It's kind of same thing Kangen does by turning the amperes up on their machines to get higher dipole in the water, a higher pH out of the water. Yes, there is more energy going to the water, but yes, you are also stressing the water more. So in electrical engineering, we're overdoing the positive charge, and too much life force is killing everything off, basically, or growing weird things like radioactivity does. So moving on, we keep seeing this particle that was discovered in the... And then we see the same toroid again with more experiments in the 17 and 1800s where they're generating thousands of volts and making ozone. And this is telling you how waterfall and ozone are natural things. So used in the right quantity, ozone can be effective. Used excessively, it's aggressive. Ozone's blue, so it's going to accelerate And it also kill good things, right? Just not bad things, because it's a very strong positioning in that energy. And just to refresh, things can couple together. Plus and minus tend to cancel, so you have nothing, and but you have lines of tension. And then the AB, like charges, they tend to actually open up a void where lines of flux disappear. Same thing around the magnet, right? You see the iron particles gathering in flux density, but then you see all these spaces. And then around the magnet immediately, when we're looking at the pole end, you see these concentric circles. So that's magnetism, the picture of the magnet. Upper right-hand corner right here is the lines going inward are the same thing as diving into the center of the toroid, and that's accelerating inwardly, and it's decelerating the outward motion. So now you can see how there's a conflict every time we go to describe things. If we look at it from the side, you see lines of tension. If you look at it from the magnetic pole ends, you see concentric circles. And this is kind of the threshold. And then where it crosses over on the inside of a polarized magnet, looking at one end in a ferrule cell, we see kind of the flower of life pattern, and in the center of that, you see a greater darkness or a void. So the two are playing, and we can even move the thing over to where we just see a void. And down here we say you can only void one condition, and space is void of all conditions. So basically I would look at that as kind of a porthole open to life energy, and it's going to take some kind of key or substance to call that in. What form of it you want. Is my foot going to step on the brakes or the gas, or are we going to do both at the same time? The truth is both are going on at the same time all the time. One is just predominant over the other one, and they always switch. One never stays on all the time dominant, so there's always a switching going on. And the seasons kind of represent that. Like winter has a certain dominance over summer. So you see like quality brewing in the winter and then manifesting in the spring and the summer. And this is what Schauberger continually talked about, is bringing quality to the breakdown or fermentation or regeneration. And you're actually brewing a different kind of life, where we tend to look at like winter and freezing as like killing everything off and stunting growth, but that's actually brewing life energy to a higher quality during that period. A bigger dipole, if you will. On the equator, you see far less dipole. You kind of see a little bit more of a monopole, so it's adapted to do things differently. I think we covered most of this very thoroughly. So there's, you can see the relative with my thumb. There's an arrangement, a design principle within the carbon gene, within the magna ray, where we would call this a blue hole, because magnetic and electric fields are actually already manifesting from life force energy. And here, because of our orientation, we have integrated North Pole. We get rid of if you notice, they're cone magnets, and they're fairly strong, even though we're not using the magnetism. And within the life force field, they cancel each other out and synergize with the life force. So even though this looks black, intuitive would see a very dense blue hole that the water's being poured through. And everybody in history has seen water as an orgone accumulator. Not many people use it that way or talk about it that way, but today when we talk about the overview Reich's work, Wilhelm Reich's work, he was like, oh, I get it. Water stores life energy and the quality of. So when Victor Schauberger was playing with charging water up, he noticed he would get red glows, and the red glows kind of were repulsive or seemed like they weren't good. And that when those appeared, he realized things were going off in the wrong way. So the blue would show up first, and then he would keep driving the system, and then eventually the red would pop up out of nowhere. And that's the system trying to break itself from somebody over-concentrating energy. So Schauberger picked up on it, but Reich measured it in the laboratory. So you can abuse any side of this equation. So, you can abuse your brakes by braking too hard, and you can over accelerate and just spin the tires and just burn your tires up and not go anywhere. And so these things are not inherently good or bad. They're just principles, and learning how to use them is the whole key. And we've already talked about the North Pole having poles within itself of accelerating and decelerating, and so the South Pole. Water from our studies is able to store the North or the South Pole as a raw energy and give it out as needed as a North or a South, meaning water is the car that has a brakes and accelerator and does do some turning. So it's like with water, it's kind of the driver of the machine. But the brain can override that, and so can the body. It's not the being. The soul is working through the computer of the brain and the intelligence of the whole body. So acceleration blue, and so braking. The reason why is because let's just say you had microbes that were pathogenic building up. If you put the brakes on as a whole, you would also put the brakes on regeneration. So time and time again, Béchamp, Reif, all these guys ran into this, and gals, you'll see, we have that, probably the most important work done by 4 different women in the understanding of the beginnings of life, the beginnings of human and all birth, and cancer, single-cell organisms without nucleus, and what that all means. So in the end, the practicality of this is every human being can easily understand what cancer is. It's not a mystery, and we should quit wasting money for the pink ribbon crap and people running around all day long accomplishing nothing. And, part of my goal is to spread out the work and how all these people in the past, Reich and Victor Schauberger and Tesla and all those guys I listed in the beginning, and these 4 hero women who kind of culminated all this as far as the root understanding of life and what happens when it gets over accelerated without the proper instruction, which is your intention, is your instruction, more or less. And every living being, including atoms and microbes, have intentions that go from simple to complex as we evolve, if you will. So what you were born out of 16.4 billion years ago, single-cell organisms and life and the earth and all the things that came about there more or less exist exactly the same in you today. So a great part of your existence today is shared in your soul, in your being, and all your body with 16.4 billion years ago. There's nothing different about it as far as anybody can tell. Nobody's ever come up with anything else. So the philosophical review of all this is be at peace with imbalance, because without it, nothing would exist. So this idea of balance that people teach all the time, they mean your balance, not everybody else's balance. Or the earth wobbles, and if it didn't, it wouldn't exist. That's how it maintains stability, is constantly hunting in a changing sea of environment, which is driven by creativity, which I call the fundamental dominant law of use, all relative stable creation, evolution. When to turn, which way to turn, is how to turn, and can only be resolved by the driver. Well, that's the thing about building relationship and the consciousness of water. It's quite a bit more intelligent than we are. So it's a gateway to work with the intelligence of the entire universe. And there's a number of ways to do that, more and more and more and more. The carbon gene was specifically designed to go way beyond our old unit while incorporating all the qualities of our old portable unit because of the human interface. So that tool works whether you believe it or not, whether you work with it deeply or shallowly or not. It works, but it's designed to fully evolve with you, not to just sit there and work on its own. And some of these materials evolve in tune, like Ormus. Like platinum's not going to behave the same when we shift it. Water's not going to behave the same when we shift it. A diamond and carbon is not going to behave the same. But we see a diamond form, under extreme pressure, right? If you don't really know what you're doing, but there's other ways to form diamonds without putting it under extreme pressure. So that's a relative term. No pain, no gain. You need to have the stress, like the coal that's getting squeezed into a diamond doesn't really see it as stress anymore because it gradually evolved to that pressure and hardened and became beautiful while it hardened. So, the goal is to limit the pain so you don't suffer. And this changes drastically to what if I'm going to go be a Navy SEAL and you're going to suffer, but you evolved to where running 20 miles a day or swimming around in 50-degree water or 40-degree water for 6 hours doesn't kill you and doesn't bother you. So everything evolves. The point is to keep the body so it can keep evolving. When you get old and you start decaying and aging, oxidizing, as they would say, burning up, that's what's going on is you're losing more and more of your ability to adapt. Your immune system's getting weaker. So all these ways with water and these elements are ways to prolong that. And all the biohackers know, there's even ways to measure this. And I've met plenty of people who, 10 years later, I see them and I'm like, wow, they look 10 years younger than they did when I saw them 10 years ago. So these anti-aging thing is not a theory at all. And it's a little more difficult in our environment, but even as you start to turn all this stuff on, change the energy of your home, makes it easier for you to change the energy of your body. How do you do that? Well, we're getting into the underpinnings of how to recognize which devices may work, which devices may not, and how all these things synergize together. Surprise is always nice, so we're not talking about the known here. We're talking about trial and error, heading in certain directions and leaning on certain probabilities that these are probably better directions to head in the whole and for regeneration and rebuilding and growth in life. So just because we get rid of something doesn't mean that there's room for the new to come in, but we have to bring that in. So you just can't get rid of the bad and expect that good's going to show up if you sit there and meditate on it forever. So there's an action as a living being, as much as you can take without too much pain, that is needed in order to kind of complete. And there's a no action, there's a rest and a peace. And so, the greatest meditation is probably good rest, and the greatest manifestation is probably good activity. And this brings out a healthy balance where we can manifest things more or less we need to because how far off we've got. Same thing as always. This is kind of my little, tetrahedron chart on, inverted, the Merkaba, if you will. It's just a different way of looking at it as like a twisted cube. I call this like a three-dimensional cube. Quality water I put at the top of it just because it's predominant all over the planet within our body. Not going to beat that down. So the mechanical analog for all this, okay, if I connect 2 points and that controls the geometry, like say on a race car, I want to control the geometry of the tire because the whole thing works on how the tire meets the ground. I have a line and 2 points, just like you learn in basic geometry. And there's a bunch of circles in here and holes and male, female, and screws. And so how do you understand all this? Why? How could this be true? Why does it work? So there's always, Tesla was really good at giving mechanical analogs of what we have here is a centrifugal pump that represents DC current, and we have a piston pump that represents alternating current, and neither of them really work on their own. But when we put them together and work them against a spring, which is the environment, and we get in tune with the vibration of the environment and how we adjust this DC-AC situation, then we achieve a resonance and the energy levels go up and we're more efficient and everything works better. So I'm trying to make that out of the basic here. So if you have a rod that you put 2 threaded ends into, if you put the same hand thread, meaning I turn it to the right to screw it in, I turn it to the left to screw it out, if you put that on a rod, they're facing opposite directions. And now this is your north and south pole. And I'm trying to explain in a mechanical analog how the north and the south pole are the same, but they're different. And what the result is when we correctly made up the 2 of them and what it takes to do that. So I can have a rod with 2 threaded ends that I adjust in length so I can change with the environment. I change the length of the rod. If I use the same hand thread on both rods, I have to take it out of the system and turn each end individually to change the length. And that's really inefficient. I have to shut down my whole system, take the rod out, and work on each end until the rods, and then put it back in. And now things change again. I got to take it back out again. So you see this on-off and lack of smoothness or lack of flow going on that would normally not be required if we understood that on one end of the rod, it's a right hand to tighten. On the other, it's a left hand to tighten. So in a way, you can achieve the same things with the North and the South Pole. That's how the South Pole has an integrated part to it. How might we do that? Well, we got to get rid of the edges, so we turn it into asymmetry again. The cone. You know, when we leave things in symmetry, they tend to get locked up. So now I can leave the rod on the vehicle and turn the whole rod with one hand, and we'll either get longer or shorter, and I don't have to take the thing apart to do it. So there's my analogy on the confusion between the North and the South Pole. But if you look at them through the same plane, through the same perspective, rotation on the right on the other side of the page is the same as rotation on the left on this side of the page. But they're doing the opposite things. So they're coming together or moving apart. And that's the full mechanical analogy for breathing. Every atom is squeezing and getting smaller and denser and storing energy, and every atom is releasing a converted form of that energy in symbiosis. Meaning, I breathe in oxygen, it comes from the plants. I breathe out CO2, and it gives back to the plants. But they convert it. It's not the same CO2. It goes through a process of nature. If either are abused, if either case are abused, the whole thing will fall apart. It will either bind, which means it can't adjust anymore, which is kind of like autoimmune. It's just stuck, and it's just going to go to survival mode. It can't adapt anymore. Or it's going to get too long and fall apart. The system will fall apart. Break or suddenly or fall apart. I want to hit back on this again. I've used this in a lot of my presentations. I pulled up an engineering program and just did this so I could get the full measure. That green circle, you actually want to kind of be as big as possible because that allows you to move around in a lot more environments and adapt without coming out of balance. There's limits to that, and these are all arbitrary. And so you can see how, you know, this whole like pH is better if it's higher or lower stuff is ridiculous. And how we, you know, as a whole being live somewhere in the center of this, say by blood pH, and certain parts of our body live off in the extremes, like the stomach and the digestive system are way over on the left in the hydrogen dominance, and, you know, the blood is just slightly in the braking category. And then what happens is the body gets stuck on the red line, like too slow, which builds bacteria and pathogens, or too fast, which builds cancer. And in the end, that polarity is working together, and it's outside the green. So you kind of hit death like out at the ends of the football, and it's both too much red and both too much blue. And it's more in the hydrogen direction because your body is absolutely like over accelerating, like grasping to stay alive. And a lot of people are coming to this understanding in the medical profession that that's kind of what cancer is more an energy of the body rather than a disease you catch. However, there are people, you know, there is some bioweapons that are, you know, recorded in history. It's no secret that they're trying to make it trickier and trickier for the body to discover these things. Now we're going to dive into a little bit of focus on Reich. Now we went over, you know, the review of the philosophy, the magnets, the crystals. Catch part one if you didn't see it, because, you know, we focused in more out of, you know, here's what a crystal is doing. Here's how you might use a crystal. And we're going to lean a little bit more towards... I may stop. Todd, did anybody pop any questions before I get into this next section?
No, you're good.
Okay, thank you. So attention and intention, they're not things. They're choices of principle. And the interaction with consciousness, right? So that's the difference with subtle energy is we're living beings, and everything is living now. Every atom is. So you can change the way a machine operates. kind of where I picked it up as a kid, that I found there was different behaviors of machines when certain people were around. And certain people had the ability to get machines to work almost all the time, uncanny, almost like in a Fonzie way, by just caring for parts of it that haven't been looked at or touched in 20 years, you know. And I found that very interesting, that this somewhat lifeless creation, you know, and my dad always pressed that upon me, that everything was alive and machines were alive when, at least when you're around, they're alive. And so treat them like it and treat them with respect. So when I got to water and realized it was really alive, it was really an amplified condition of how you treat it. So intention, so we have these magnetic fields, right, which science says are measurable quantum fields. They're not physical, but we can quantify them because they do interact with the quantum world, or they do manifest electrons, which are kind of half quantum and half not, and totally misunderstood because they have a north and a south pole. The North Pole is a positive electrical charge. The South Pole is a negative electrical charge. Everything vibrates, therefore they both exist together. But a human being with intention could override the magnet's attraction to the North Pole. And those were some of the experiments that were done by Reichenbach. So your intention and attention can override the positioning of atoms, water at the atomic level, its polar level. Most people are not capable of doing it, though. So now we're bringing out tools to help train you, and that's really what this is all about, and give you knowledge where you can use your own tools. So now Wilhelm Reich, there's all these different energies. Orgone energy is what he called it. Last week we talked about odic energy and negative odd and positive odd. And that was von Reichenbach, and he used human beings to verify this. And it turns out, you know, it corroborates and is correlated with everybody else's teaching too. And the blue energy, like look at the sky, look at the water. Blue to green, that's going to be where your dominance, right? Your equilibrium to your blue is going to be your dominant features, and those help you, give you a guideline of where those colors exist and when and why and what their qualities are. Red, you know, a volcano, where do we see red in nature? When the sun's rising and the sun's setting, and there's a lot of resistance in the atmosphere because of the lens cut. We see a red shift there, or slowing down. Red shift means slowing down. So you see, even throughout all physics, they subconsciously come out with these color codes that reinforce exactly what all the subtle energy is saying. Only this stuff comes way before it. So Wilhelm Reich, I love him for this statement because this is what I believe. When human beings' consciousness gets to the point where we realize it's simple, and you don't need an institution to tell you what's okay to do and what's not okay to do, and you can rely that the solution for anything is all the way around you, like a woodsman when you go out into the woods. The remedy for a problem is all in the same place because you can't separate the North and the South Pole. So, you know, there you go. And Reich said the same thing, that when he's saying when your average person, your working class people, become structurally capable of administering it, they're not going to be conscious of what their responsibility is with it. So, in other words, they'll right now people would abuse it. They would overdo it. It's kind of how our consciousness is. We get something good and we do it so much that we make it into a bad thing, and then now it sucks because we've wrecked it. We've overused it. We've abused it. We've disrespected it. So the transition from Reich to von Reichenbach, or von Reichenbach to Reich, despite all of von Reichenbach's painstaking work, his discoveries were not accepted. Well, nobody accepted any of these throughout all histories. That's nothing new. The emerging science of electricity, which is kind of a more hardcore manifest of life force energy and overuse, if you will, of it, could be measured easy. So, of course, we could spread that out. You didn't need sensitives. You didn't need special people to do this stuff. And so the life force kind of got dropped. And so Reich highly opposed the kind of philosophy of Nazi Germany. Of course, anybody would. and he obsessed with understanding the nature of life. So in the 30s, he did, and he was a real measured guy, just like von Reichenbach, like conventionally trained doctor, a ton of experience with pathology and under the microscope. And perhaps the most amazing thing he ever did, besides point out that there's more tangible forms of life force energy, was his work with predicting what the causative pathology agent of cancer was. Not what cancer is, but what the destructive pathology of cancer is. And they're entirely two different things. And that kind of breaks down this complex like mystery of cancer to a large degree. And I love teaching that. I work directly with people who research with it, and I share this stuff with them, and about how you would potentially slow down by using a localized magnetic field. And this is a case where you probably wouldn't want to use the north, and you probably wouldn't want to use the integrated part. You'd probably want to use the braking part of the magnet. So indeed, whether it's the north or south pole, when people use the edge of the magnet, they can generally see reduced microbial breeding within the tumor and reduced tumor enlargement. I'm not making any medical claims. I'm just sharing my own opinion and what other people's opinion gives. So I'm not saying to use any of this. Always consult somebody who knows what they're doing, or experiment on your own, because it's just a magnet. It's just a crystal. It's all woo-woo. It doesn't do anything. So then basically Reich starts with bions. So he takes sand and sterilizes it, and then finds strains it, gets all the sand out, puts what's left in a culture, and finds these glowing things in there. And then he takes these glowing things and he mixes them with cancer cells, and he noticed that this blue light, so now we have a case of where the blue light or the acceleration, right? But we don't know what these bions were giving off, and what their orientation of north and south, and the integrative part of that, the accelerating part of that, or the braking part of that. And so if this gets confusing, just picture yourself driving a car and going, I need to slow down, or I need to speed up here. So if cancer is cells replicating too fast, you wouldn't want to step on the gas there underneath all that. That's all I'm saying. What actually happens in the real world is subject to trial and error and practice. You might use that energy to accelerate competing bacteria in your gut to outcompete the nasty bacteria that are born within the tumors and their branches that reach out into the bloodstream and the organ, right? Because that's what they live off of. So he's also very famous for cloudbusters and manipulating water with concentrating orgone, what he called orgone energy, or deconcentrating it. He's also the guy that is responsible for concentrating orgone, and also the guy who's responsible for over-concentrating orgone and trying to learn how to not do that. He didn't use water in his orgone accumulators, and I would largely say that was his biggest error in over-concentrating orgone. He concentrated it in air, and air has little to no buffer compared to water. He's also the first modern Western scientist to point out that radiation is attenuated in the presence of these energy fields, these life force fields. And he did that with radium. Remember how they used to have radium watches, so you wore like active radiation around your wrists? So when he would put these crystals or these concentrated odic fields, and we're talking south and North Pole. Now, some of these guys got extreme with these poles, because he called it deadly orgone. He called the South Pole life field deadly, and the North Pole he called it positive, life-giving. And really, it's both of them again. So he would concentrate both of these forces. And he also experimented with looking at it. Many sensitives. I've personally experienced this. You can see the gold particles and a little bit of the black, and especially occurs during certain situations. And the more you do it, the more you look at it. And sunlight's involved, and the air is involved. Water can be involved. The more and more you see it, they're like golden particles in the air. There's also little black particles in the air, And I'm not speaking of the protein breakdown in the lenses of your eyes. I'm speaking of stuff actually out away from you. So T. bacillus, he's the one who kind of started up the whole, hey, I know what the nasty creature is and why the cancer runs rapid and takes off into stage 5. I know the mechanism of it. And of course, he got blasted. And then Reich went on to identify it. Reich went on to identify it way further. And there's a bunch of people identifying it today, and we found out you don't really need a crazy microscope to see what's going on. First to overconcentrate, and he really got quacked out because he proposed that sexual suppression, which I don't believe he was 100% like applying this to, like, you know, sex like porn or anything, or orgies or anything like that. I think he was applying it more like to female energy being suppressed in a certain way and masculine, and how those cancel out during sex. And don't think he was really biased one way or another to the North or South Pole or however that worked equation. But when people hit on him, he was like, yeah, him and Freud were total quack jobs and, you know, whatever. Probably, you know, who knows the truth? I wasn't there. So I brought this up because the bions and even cancer, like accelerated growth, Reich said it came back as a beautiful aquamarine substance. So this accelerated growth, the beginnings of life, the simple wizard of all time from the beginning of time when life first formed. And now we know this happens in water before it even becomes a yeast cell or a single cell organism without a nucleus, which is the definition of cancer, by the way. So don't let anyone tell you that there's a brain cancer or liver cancer or a lung cancer or skin cancer. It's all the same. It's just where it's manifesting. So they're giving you the location where non-instructed growth is too rapid. And this forms a womb that has a high pH that breeds bacteria and hybrids called the actinomyces, which have been bred as weapons, that more or less proliferate and reach out, tap into your blood, but they filter your blood because they're just tapping nutrients that they need, minerals, to grow and grow fast, extremely fast. And then when they're ready, you know, they come out and attack the host, and it happens quick. And you die from a fungal infection, which is basically mycotoxins. You die from your blood going acid, which is why everybody thinks acid is bad, because the doctors are all overreacting to this, like, fear of acid. And more or less, you know, it's nature's, you're breathing in things at that point that nature's sending in to break down your body, because that's the stage you're in. And that can be very suffering. Everybody's going to change state, which they call death. So the idea is to minimize the suffering and not get caught up in a whole lot of this, and let that happen after your soul has left its race car, and go from there. So it's kind of the more practical side about it. Inside your body is T. bacillus, probably a hybrid version, that allows human life to occur. So Jerry Tennant talks about this, so I'm talking about what he talks about and all the discovery and history that led to the definition of cancer. And why Wilhelm Reich is because 4 women that didn't really work together in the beginning basically verified what Wilhelm Reich said what cancer was in the pathological, deadly version of it. Otherwise, every woman and every man and every living thing has a normal amount of cancer in them, and they work with the body. The terrain changes. You get too stressed. You have no release for that stress. I think that's why, like, you know, Reich was kind of big on the sex, as he says, very good for healing and releasing stress. But there's a number of other things you would have to do beyond that. And if you abuse that, you overpopulate the planet, which is kind of what we've done in a sense for the way we live. So now we need to catch up on our consciousness. So, we can have more people on the planet and we don't ruin the thing and essentially choose to be parasites, which is the line we're kind of on right now. And most people's consciousness, if you give them handouts and give them more, they'll take more, and they'll burn down the earth doing it while they're proposing to being green. And like electric cars, right? You get into the snobby spiritual characters who claim they're on the cutting edge of saving the earth because they drive an electric car and because they whatever. That's all so far from the truth, because the method involves mining and burning things up and destroying them so they're no longer useful, dumping them back into nature, usually in the waterways, which we can't get out because the energy's stuck in the waterway, so we reconsume it. Now we got this terrible cycle going on. You're going to hear more and more about it, but it's nothing new. It's been going on for a long time now. It's just regular science can't deny it anymore, and there's ways to change this across the board. At any rate, this picture here is we frequently see under the microscope. I'm actually got a microscope probably somewhere around 400 or 600 digital, and we're looking at one of the artifacts in our flow forms for our structured water units. And these aren't all over the place, and there is lights on here, so I'm not saying this thing is emitting aquamarine light, but this is the similar type of light that Reich saw in the sand and the bions. And we do have a lot of special kind of form of silicon in these units. All the white you see is the silicon, and the dark you see is shungite, and it's mixed into a crystalline medium and fits the definition for an orgone accumulator. So we have an orgone accumulator that we make that has a shape that causes the water to flow a certain way, that also has all sorts of earth crystals in it, and it's from the North Pole, which is, kind of weird when we get down deep into it, and I don't want to confuse everybody, but it's sitting up there more towards the integrated field, I'll say, whether that's actually a north or a south. Let's call it the bio-south and not necessarily the magnetic north. That's more for a magnet, not for the planet. And so you'll find these in the flow form. So the water's picking up the character of very old elements that are massaged by life subtle energies differently than if we went and grabbed some carbon out of our campfire and just put it into the equation or made that into a filter or whatever. Orgone accumulators. Here's the definition from Reich. There's a lot of people. I've had a lot of hagglers, who claim to be experts at everything, who didn't even study the people who invented this stuff. Like, people who study pleomorphism never study Béchamp, act like they know everything about it. That's kind of what Louis Pasteur did, is pretend like they were the super discovery of it all. So we start with the basis to keep the language. And more or less by his own admission, the ORAC, or the orgone accumulator, was accumulating both charges. And so depending on how you design your accumulator, you can lean towards accumulating different types of charges. And in order to see if they work, you might use radionics, you might use dowsing, you might do it with a pendulum, you might do it with a rod, you might do it with the substance in your hand, you might do it with a more proven sensitive that lives by you, that's a healer. And they do exist. The Jesus healing thing actually exists fairly widely across the human race, and more of that'll come on because you got to train yourself to do it. And there's a bunch of tools that they use to do it, and the better they get with it, they can just do it with their fingers. So when a healer is viewed by another sensitive, when the healer focuses and goes into healing mode, out of the right hand, they see blue flame-like substances coming out of the fingertips. There you go. There's no magnet, there's no crystal, there's a human body. So the human body is an orgone accumulator. The earth is an orgone accumulator. So it's kind of like this has gotten so ridiculous that everything is an orgone accumulator, and you can kind of see where things are working and where they're not, and perhaps how to help it out. And then if you do something and it doesn't work and it does the opposite, then you know what to do. Just change the way you used it. I like this, how Orgonite works. I just ripped this off of a website somewhere. I don't make our Orgone accumulators in this way. I use, so it's alternating layers of organic material, which doesn't really have to be organic. It has to be more of an insulator. But I think more natural things like wood and water make better ones. Plastic, believe it or not, is completely organic. It's totally made out of hydrocarbons. Whether they're toxic or not is subject to the energy they're brought into and the time of transformation. And so, and this is a resin, like you do these out of resin. So these are how the carbon gene orgone accumulators and shielding are built. And then we use water as a transmuting, living part of an orgone accumulator. These pyramids and stuff transmute like very slow. They're not dynamic like water. So the carbon gene itself, by definition, is an orgone accumulator, and totally designed that way. And in my opinion, works a little bit better than pyramids. But since things are moving around, it might not be as stable, if you will. And then here they say negative energy oxidize the blood and tissues. Well, that could help in certain circumstances and hurt in others. And tissue regeneration, that's because it's ground to a point here. If this was a cube, it would have a plus and a minus bias, and you wouldn't have the integrative field, and you'd have to hold it a certain way. It would be different. So shape completely matters. And the cloud busters, it's the same thing. And water came into play here, where a lot of people take a cloud buster and they don't connect it to anything, and they're living out in the middle of the desert and they're trying to make it rain. And I'm like, that's not how it worked. But there's people selling this stuff online calling it a cloud buster. And I've done this principle in the laboratory in a different way, through gas medium, through just using water and plasma systems and things like this. And there's a very articulate way of doing this. So it's true. I've never built cloud busters and tried to move clouds out of the way or make it rain. And he was mostly dissipating clouds with it. And later on, it kind of evolved where they said he learned how to break up clouds to stop it from raining. So he originally started with stopping things from raining, and then he, apparently learned how to make it rain. But obviously, you can abuse all this stuff. So you can't make it rain every day. And you can't, make it dry every day. You kind of let nature take its course, but we can help it along in its trends. Historically, there's a lot of stories of societies having knowledge of all this stuff and abusing it. And they say that's the reason for like the blue buds and the elites and the hybrids all more or less like not wanting us to know any of this stuff. So it's all quarantined in black magic. More or less, which magic isn't black and magic isn't magic. It's this stuff and how to more articulately do it. So there's a picture of Reich's Cloudbuster, and if you compare it to what people are trying to spin off today, obviously this thing, if that was, I don't believe it was for a second that was copper wire. I believe there's another equation to that. Which requires much further study, but that stuff there in today's age would be very, very expensive, and your average person wouldn't be building cloud busters. And they do alter the weather all the time. That technology's been around, and you can do it chemically, right? So they know the charge of a cloud, and then certain chemicals, if they disperse them into that cloud, those charges will do things that make it either rain or dissipate the cloud, based on the charge of the elements they're putting in there, which we kind of went over that simplicity earlier. So what he realized about this cloudbuster, a connection between orgone and water and surface tension, right? And that is oversimplified because the tension in the center of the water is different from the edges of the water. So where are we measuring this surface tension? And as we move along with our research, that's what we're pointing out to everybody. It's not ever this or that. Here's the gold particles. They say sensitive C in the air. I don't think you really need to be sensitive. I think if you're blue-eyed, you're more likely to see these. gold particles, and then the black ones are kind of harder to see. Most of you wouldn't even notice, and that would be the deadly orgone. And so more or less, if you know what you're doing, nature's always going to concentrate these golden particles, and it's going to be in the air and water and the fire and the earth, our 4 elements, right? And water happens to be able to hit the triple point to manifest carbon, which is representative of young earth. And so water to me is like the square, the logic, the foundation, the fluidity, the creativity, the ether itself embodied. And I would put that at the point of the tetrahedron. And then these other things are manifest out of water. And we're not talking liquid water, we're talking principle. Radiation attenuation. So here's probably where the Wi-Fi stuff comes from, and all this was originally done by Reich. Basically, he noticed that anything that was radioactive, sort of his watch lights went out when he kept working with this concentrational orgone. And so basically his watch hands wouldn't illuminate from the radium anymore, and they started to flicker on and off. And supposedly, you can't alter radiation. Water plasma historically has been rumored to completely shut radiation off or transmute it. And reportedly, that's well known within the higher ranks in that field, but somebody doesn't want that to happen. Didn't benefit everybody, I guess, in the making the money chain or whatever it all is. I don't really know. Crisis at the laboratory. So he started concentrating life force field and then overdid it. And so when he overdid it, negative effects started to show up. And so I would call into the question the design of an ORAC. What he was doing when he first discovered this, and where it's evolved to with the silicon pyramids and water being an orgone accumulator and surrounding it with the right materials to accelerate it to support life. Those are much better and safer and almost foolproof methods of doing it versus the other. Almost all scientists, and I started this way, and experimenters and developers will push it. It's like a race car. If you don't spin the thing out, you didn't drive. You have to spin the car out to know what the limits of that particular setup are. And even if you do, you go back and set it up so you can go faster without spinning it out again. And that's the struggle you go through every day to a degree if you're trying to improve. If you're already where you want to be and you're content, you can maintain that position longer and cause less suffering and less pain and help other people do the same thing, which is the point of all this. So spiraling and cavorting motion, and the reason why Reich talked about this, that all this stuff is spiraling, is next week or next month, whenever we do the next part 3, we're going to do cozy rev and Russian work and torsion physics, which will lead us to Schauberger, who I believe, even though he was way more subjective and intuitive, who centered his whole life around observing water, actually had the most detailed explanation for how all this life energy works, and did have quite a bit of overreaction because I believe he had such a deep relationship with water and its physical, female quality, that he was very protective of it and almost carried a guilt for the waterway he wrecked by showing people how to move logs more efficiently by changing the behavior of the water by engaging it in certain motion. And so Reich right away's observations connected with prana, which is going to kind of be a certain form of Middle Eastern to Eastern region at the time of ancient culture, who equated it to a higher dimension. So what we're talking about here is opening up a little bit more porthole to the next dimension over, which is somewhat protected from being too far open. So you really got to know what you're doing to open this stuff up big. And that's where you get into free energy and concentrating stuff and trying not to do damage with it. And water is just an awesome gateway of opening and closing to protect both sides of the equation, this dimension and that dimension or anything in between. But that's when I say dimension, there's a different dimension when there's a different space, meaning every atom has its own domain and dimension and has a connection to the universal string. And every single thing that we can identify and perceive and can't identify and perceive is all connected in a one communication system real time. So everything exists now and everything is creative and changing now. And then there's the perception, or where we put the brakes on, stop this thing and take a look at it. That's not a reality, but we try and do that. You know, everything's moving. Nobody's ever identified a stop in any of this, and life is always just transforming. Death means the transformation of life. Nothing stops. No. Air prana, solar prana, ground prana. Air, fire. Look at the language here. It's the same as the Native American, you know. And I worked with water that was capable of being in the state of liquid, gas, fire, all at the same time, right? And it would behave like a carbon, which is the basis for the Earth cycle right now, which is an octave of silicon. Air and ground pranas are called vitality globules in esoteric. They are seen as by clairvoyance. That's changing. Like what is formerly known 100 years ago as clairvoyant or sensitive is somewhat going to be any human being who becomes conscious of this, who wants to practice it. You're being given that. So I highly recommend this book because a couple of months ago it was $900 on Amazon, and I popped on there today to grab the picture, and it was $27. And I don't know how that happened, but these books are hard to get. It's 120 pages. These four women basically identified the T bacillus in a staining method that was responsible for activating the hormone that tells your immune system not to attack cancer cells. And that's the cliff notes I'm going to give on that. And Cantwell does some very good work there. And there are modern day researchers that are bending the oncologist's ear, and there are oncologists who have seen live proof of Reich machines work, and good ones. So we're making ground on this infiltration of the Smiths and the program they're carrying out. That's just kind of, and I don't unsupport. I know what goes on in a tumor. So if you can remove it without causing a bleed spread of the spores, which often happens, but and that's why doctors, they know what happens who've been doing this for a long time. So if they don't think they can get the roots out and it's going to bleed, they're like, these spores will spread all over your body. So what happened to brain cancer? What happened to liver cancer now? So even they know, you know, they're just part of the system and caught in the system and are in the matrix program, but they are changing. So there's four women who basically did the bottom line work and explained it where every university in the United States could understand it and identify it. Whereas Reich, he gave the solutions to a shallow degree, but you could hold off this critter. So, you know, once somebody goes through chemotherapy and the cancer spores go dormant and it comes back, the survival rate's 2 to 3%, and everybody knows this. So once it comes back after you suppress it by poisoning your blood, whatever I think there's better methods that don't poison you so bad, and you can take SEACT to counteract it, right? Use these ancient methods to help all this stuff. And the important thing in here is cancer itself is not a disease at all. It's what breeds when your body hits this final layer of spaz out, of I need to survive, and how your body can't stop it anymore because there's a critter who may or may not be a biological weapon that tells your body to ignore the cancer fact. And that was predicted by Wilhelm Reich way before any of these people identified the pathology of it fully. And so what that tells me is Reich was a very well-trained, in-the-loop pathologist who saw a factual basis in the life force energy and therefore deserves a look being taken out of the quack box and put into one of the greatest scientists whoever cared about humanity and the health of the planet. And all these guys were great retired guys, or great professional guys. And I was like, man, there's got to be some women in this equation. And I was turned on to this book by one of my colleagues that we were doing back engineering of the Reich microscope, because I had taken a pretty in-depth interest in Royal Raymond Reich and how he used physics to see further than any human being had seen before. And that kind of brings us to a close on the subtle energy in Reich. And to finish out, for those of you who made it through the longer version of this, I like to keep it to an hour, but we had some technical difficulties, and that's just how it flowed. So round one was Odic energy, Baron von Reichenbach, and how that's the same as orgone energy, and how the two of them's perception was similar but not the same. Part three will be going into Russian physicists and torsion fields, and I will bring some video of a torsion field, numerous cases of it that I have on video from water plasma and experimenting with water plasma. And you'll see that manifest into the physical world, into a piezo crystal and camera lens, where we couldn't see it with our bare eyes, but the camera could clearly see it. And it's not Carillion. It was a, back in the day, pre-cell phone, when you bought them little digital cameras. A regular camera wouldn't get it. It didn't really have the aperture and bandwidth. And so you'll see a moving UV torsion field that the camera could see, and then you'll see a physical movement of water through a gaseous field where there's torsion in the plasma. So we kind of have physical verification for this stuff also. This is what got me like so into all this stuff, is I was watching it happen before I had mechanisms to explain it. And I was happy to know that many people in history had also observed the same phenomena that I was seeing, stumbling across in my own development and experimentation. And so a great deal of this knowledge that the Nazis, believe it or not, were borrowing from a certain more ancient civilization, their physics, to try and be independent and alive as the world condensed on them during the war machine.